so sorry.
Thank you, Senator Manchin. I just have to say, I love these conversations. I just truly do. When I think about our energy potential, when I think about what it is that we have and how we are able to supply it. And Senator Manchin, I've had an opportunity to go to your little state and see your all of the above. We recognize the great contributions that come out of Nevada when we're talking about minerals. I talk about Alaska all the time, but you know, when we think about diversity of energy supply, I think it's important to recognize that within this country, we have a diversity of supply based on our enormous geography, and recognizing where we each can be those experts, those suppliers, those real drivers to our locals, state and national economies. I think that is quite significant to recognize. You know, as much as contributes from the Gulf of Mexico, they talk about being the energy breadbasket. Okay, that is one energy breadbasket, but I think this is important to recognize that we all have so much to contribute in so many different areas, and oftentimes we are just limited by the technologies that allow us to do a little bit more. It was mentioned, you, Mr. Mills, mentioned the digitalization of energy in your testimony. Dr. Barol also mentioned that in his written testimony, and I should note for the record, he was actually here for a few moments. I really appreciate him making that effort to try to join us, but his schedule was very, very complicated this morning. But you think about that, the technology that we know today is what we know today, but the advances that we've made in the past 20 years, as has been noted by many of you, has just been nothing short of remarkable, beyond imagination. And so think where we're going to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and particularly within the space of the renewables. I think we have so much that we can build out given again advancements in technologies. But I come back to our hardcore reality, and that's not meant to be a pun on words, but so much of this is going to depend on these resources, these mineral resources that will be required to build out these technologies of the future. And for years we talked about our vulnerability as a nation on oil. We still have that vulnerability when it comes to the Department of Defense and this extraordinary reliance on that fossil fuel. But I don't want us to go the same direction with our minerals as we used to be with our oil. So this needs to be an eyes wide open. I have advanced my critical minerals bill. It's actually part of our energy bill that I'm hopeful we'll have an opportunity to advance on the Senate floor shortly. But how do we do more? And this is a question for you, Mr. McGroarty, in terms of building the awareness that we have this increasing dependency. It's kind of tough to move forward sometimes unless people recognize that this is a problem for us, but that we do have solutions here. I think federal permitting reform is one of the things that we need to be looking at. But how do we build a growing awareness? And I don't want to limit this to just Mr. McGroarty, because General Cheney, you know, when we think about the implications, again, from a national security perspective, making sure that those who are part of this supply chain understand that we've got to address this aspect of it as well. So we're going to have to conclude the hearing here because we've got a vote that is coming on, but I'd like to have a little conversation about how we do more on the awareness of this as a dependency issue. Mr. McGroarty? Yeah.
Senator, is really interesting to think. First of all, I mean, what we're up against is we have
we live in this marvelous world where so much of the things that we rely on every day seem to be magic, and they just kind of have, you know, there's a cloud and stuff goes up to the cloud and things, you know, energy moves to where it's needed and so on and so forth. I think we forget the physicality of things. Now, the physicality of things is rooted in material science, and it's rooted in materials. So I think what this committee does, what these kinds of programs do, but you know, more of it, is to remind people that, you know, we are now using a far larger portion of the periodic table than we ever used in the history of mankind. And we have to be attentive to where these materials are coming from. We're very fortunate. We're very blessed that we have these resources here. I would say, too, in some respects, it seems to me a very simple thing that government can do is even just an indication that you can send a signal to a market that there's a desire to source some of these products domestically, and that will have an effect. I mean, and I don't mean to, I'm not casting aspersions on things done or not done, but for instance, I'm very focused on the Gigafactory, figuring out where they're going to get their materials domestically for a variety of different reasons, jobs, national security, but also, you know, if you think about it today, we're getting the bulk of our cobalt comes from DRC Congo. We can't be comfortable about that. Because we're not comfortable about that, it's getting refined and smelted in China, creating leverage there. We need graphite, we're 100% dependent on graphite. We need manganese, we're 100% dependent on manganese. We need lithium. A lot of that's coming from a triangle in South America, which is prone to instability over time. So figuring out how we could substitute with American-sourced materials is important, but the simplest way to do that is for someone to say, we want American-sourced materials. We see that as a positive, and communicating that clearly. It's a market signal that would cause capital markets to look around and say, well, who could that be? Where would that come from? You know, and I sit here and I see the states and I think about, you know, Senator Franken's gone, but, you know, I could mention nickel and cobalt, and there's Minnesota, in the upper part of Minnesota. We have graphite. Pardon? You have graphite. I was about to mention that. Thank you. Yeah. You know, so we have all of these different options. Gosh, there's some lithium in Nevada that could be just making a very short trip to the Gigafactory. So I just don't think we lived and experienced the bad and the good of where our oil comes from and how we needed more of it for decades, and the better part, you know, and how that skews national security and military strategy. I just don't think we're caught up yet in terms of this transformation that's happening in the rest of the periodic table and how much of it we need. And this stuff isn't fairy dust. It's, you know. Anybody else want to weigh in there? I appreciate that, Mr. McGrady.
Well, Senator, if I could add the elephant in the room with respect to mining in the United States. Early in my career, I worked for a Canadian mining company and spent time on the border of Alaska, the Northwest Territories. Canada mines a lot of its minerals. It's easier to open a mine in Canada than in the United States. That shouldn't be the case. So the elephant in the room is EPA and how we regulate. It's typically not the states, but it can be. So until we make an affirmative decision that we care about having mining here, I know if you talk to capital markets, people who invest in mining, they'll tell you unequivocally, hold a hearing on it, I think you will hear every one of them tell you the same thing. The capital risks are high because of the regulatory delays and uncertainty. As long as we keep that in play, we'll continue to source rare earths and everything else from other nations. And we provided 70% of the world's rare earths 20 years ago. As my colleague has just said, we now do zero. That's not because they ran out of rare earths. It's not because we don't have the technology to do it. We have some of the best miners on the planet and the best technology and the safest. But we've made an affirmative decision not to do it. I think that's a mistake.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree, and it is a concern. I think the statistic was that the United States ranks dead last, or we're tied with Papua New Guinea in terms of the length of time it takes to permit a mine in this country. And I think you're right. There has been a policy direction that has taken us on that path. But I think it's something that we need to critically look at and evaluate, because our situation is such that more and more we expect, without question, that these resources are going to be made available to us. And it seems that more and more these resources are coming from places that would not think twice about perhaps squeezing us a little bit. So recognizing that vulnerability is something that I think we must address and we must consider from a broader policy perspective. Senator Cortez Masto, we've got a vote going on, but thank you for staying throughout this very important hearing. I know that many of my colleagues, not only some of those that were flitting in and out, we've had a little bit of preoccupation with another subject matter this morning, so I apologize for that. But know that you all have cleared my head and given me focus in the energy space, and I greatly appreciate that. Thank you for your participation this morning and for your ongoing leadership in these important areas. We stand adjourned.